In the dark alleys of China, 1988, a shadow lurked unnoticed. A killer whose very presence sent chills through the streets, preying on the vulnerable. For over 14 years, the fear he spread would leave the country shaken to its core. 11 innocent women and young girls would lose their lives, and the truth remained hidden. Who was behind these horrific crimes, and why did they choose these victims? Today, we delve into the chilling story of Gao Chengyong, the murderer who earned the name China's Jack the Ripper. As the dark figure walked the streets, no one could have imagined the terror he would bring. For years, the authorities would search for clues, but Gao Chengyong's name would remain elusive until the truth finally began to surface. In 1988, Gao's reign of terror began. His first victims, young women and girls, were found lifeless, their bodies left in unimaginable conditions. What was the method behind these brutal killings, and what drove this man to commit such gruesome acts? Across 3 decades, the killings continued, each case more disturbing than the last. Despite the best efforts of investigators, Gao slipped through their fingers time and again, evading capture, even as the body count grew. With every murder, Gao seemed to leave behind not just evidence, but a trail of unanswered questions. What motivated him? What was his connection to the victims? And why did he target them specifically? Though the killer's identity was hidden in the shadows, his pattern became clear. He targeted women, often attacking them in their homes at night. But the most chilling part? He never left a trace, never left a sign of struggle. A methodical predator. For over a decade, Gao Chengyong evaded justice, hiding in plain sight. His calm demeanor and the ability to blend into his surroundings allowed him to remain undetected while the families of his victims suffered. But who was he truly? With each passing year, the case became colder, but Gao's dark journey was far from over. The mystery grew deeper, and his reign of terror seemed unstoppable. What would it take for the truth to finally emerge? In 2002, the killings abruptly stopped. Was Gao finally satisfied, or had he simply disappeared? The question lingered in the air, unanswered, as authorities continued their search. But the story doesn't end here. What dark secrets lay hidden in Gao Chengyong's past? And what caused this seemingly quiet man to descend into a monster? Gao Chengyong, born in 1966 in the remote village of Gansu, China, seemed like an ordinary man. Growing up in a turbulent, isolated environment, Gao's life didn't appear to hold any extraordinary promise. But sometimes, beneath the surface of the most ordinary lives, there lies a darkness waiting to emerge. As a child, Gao was described as quiet, withdrawn, and perhaps troubled, but nothing suggested he would go on to commit such horrific crimes. His life was marked by poverty, his parents distant, and his relationships with others minimal. Could the seeds of violence have been sown in such a quiet, neglected environment? At first glance, Gao's personality seemed unremarkable. He was not a social outcast, nor did he show signs of psychopathy early on. But one has to wonder, did his upbringing, marked by neglect and hardship, contribute to the monster he would become? Despite his unremarkable exterior, something dark stirred within him. It was in 1988, at the age of 22, that Gao committed his first murder. But what led him to make this life-altering choice? Psychologists suggest that childhood trauma, combined with a sense of powerlessness, often triggers such violent impulses. Childhood trauma is often a significant factor in the psychology of serial killers. Gao's early experiences marked by isolation and neglect could have contributed to the deep-seated anger that later manifested in his killings. Psychological studies on serial offenders often highlight their need to regain control over their environment, particularly through violence. However, Gao's motivations were not driven by immediate anger or revenge. The killer's method was methodical. His calm demeanor in the aftermath of the murders suggests a more disturbing truth: he didn't just kill for vengeance. He killed for power. His attacks were calculated. He stalked his victims, carefully selecting the most were vulnerable, alone, and accessible. Gao's pattern indicates that the thrill for him was not just in the act of killing, but in the dominance he exerted over his victims, and the fear he instilled in the community. Psychologically, Gao exhibited traits of what is known as a power-driven killer. Unlike those motivated by anger, Gao's murders were not about emotional release. Instead, his killings seemed to give him a sense of superiority and control, a theme seen in many serial offenders, who often have a warped view of power. Although Gao's actions were heinous, they provide us with a chilling glimpse into the psychological makeup of a killer. His crimes weren't just the result of mental illness, they were a calculated, though disturbed, attempt to reclaim a sense of power he lacked in his earlier life. So, what caused Gao to transform from a quiet, withdrawn young man into a ruthless killer? Is it the legacy of a painful childhood, or something deeper within him that pushed him toward a life of violent crime? With each of Gao Chengyong's murders, the pattern became more apparent. It wasn't just the victims he targeted, it was how he chose to end their lives. The brutality of his actions left the police and the public shocked, but his methods were disturbingly consistent, hinting at a precise and calculated mind. Gao's weapon of choice: a sharp knife. His victims were often attacked in their homes, where they should have felt safest. His preferred method was slashing the throat, silent, efficient, and cold. But there was something more disturbing than just the act of murder itself. Gao's attacks showed a clear need for control. Each crime scene was marked by a chilling absence of struggle. Gao's victims didn't fight back. He chose them carefully, vulnerable, alone, and most importantly, unaware. It was this sense of complete control, this ability to strike without resistance, that defined his killings. But Gao didn't just kill. He left his victims in grotesque states, their bodies positioned in ways that seemed almost ritualistic. There was no sign of theft or sexual assault, just death. What could it mean when a killer's actions seem so meticulously planned, yet devoid of any clear motive beyond the killing itself? His victims were often found in the same condition, bound, with their throats slashed. No weapon other than the knife. The deliberate nature of these killings suggests a mind that was not acting out of rage, but out of a calculated desire to inflict terror. The coldness of his actions speaks volumes about his character. Investigators soon realized that there was a dark logic behind the crimes. Gao didn't just want to kill, he wanted to instill fear. He chose his victims for their vulnerability, and his method was efficient, almost surgical. It was as if the killings were part of a greater, twisted plan, driven by the need to dominate. Gao's lack of emotional response during the killings suggests that his crimes were more about power than passion. Unlike crimes of anger or jealousy, where emotions run high, Gao's murders were dispassionate, cold, and precise, traits commonly associated with serial killers who derive satisfaction from the act itself. At the heart of Gao's methodology was control. He exercised complete dominance over his victims, choosing them at will, striking without hesitation. For him, The act of killing wasn't just about murder, it was about the power it gave him. The absolute control over life and death. Despite his careful planning, there were moments when Gao's arrogance showed through. He believed he was untouchable. His ability to evade capture for so long became part of his identity, a part of the power he craved. His confidence only grew with each successful kill, feeding into his belief that he could never be caught. But eventually, all killers make a mistake. And in the case of Gao Chengyong, it was his arrogance that would lead to his downfall. But by then, the damage was done. The question remained, what had driven this man to kill in such a calculated, cold-blooded way? Why did Gao Chengyong kill? The question that plagued investigators for decades. Was it an act of sheer madness, or was there a deeper, more disturbing psychological rationale behind his actions? To understand this killer, we must delve into the depths of his mind, where childhood trauma, power, and obsession may have played crucial roles. Experts believe that childhood trauma can be a key factor in the development of violent behavior. Gao Chengyong's early life, marked by poverty, neglect, and isolation, likely set the stage for his later crimes. As a child, Gao felt abandoned by his parents, with little emotional support to guide him through the hardships of life. The lack of emotional nurturing can create a void in a child's psyche, a void that some may try to fill with violence or control. Gao's initial killings didn't seem to be fueled by hatred or anger alone, they were an expression of his need for power, a desire to regain control over his environment in the most devastating way possible. Another key factor in understanding Gao's motivations is the concept of serial killer psychology. Psychologists often identify a need for power and control as a central driving force behind serial killings. Gao didn't just want to kill, he wanted to dominate. His calm demeanor after each murder was evidence of a mind that was not driven by passion, but by the cold, calculated pursuit of power. Unlike other killers who may act impulsively or out of rage, Gao's crimes were methodical. He stalked his victims, often choosing them for their vulnerability, which further highlights the calculated nature of his murders. His victims didn't fight back, they were easy targets, and Gao reveled in the absolute control he exerted over their lives. Gao's psychology was that of a predator, his every move deliberate, his every action a means of asserting his dominance. For Gao, killing was not just about the act itself, it was about the power it gave him over his victims, and the fear it instilled in the community. He wasn't just murdering, he was making a statement. Was there a specific reason Gao targeted young women and girls? Experts argue that this may have been tied to his deep-rooted feelings of powerlessness in his early life. Many serial killers develop fixations on specific victim types, often linked to unresolved childhood trauma. For Gao, it may have been a twisted attempt to gain the control he lacked growing up. Psychologically, Gao's need for control grew with each killing. In many serial killers, this escalation is evident. Each murder becomes a way to regain power, to reinforce their sense of superiority. Gao was no different. The more successful his crimes were, the more confident and bold he became, leading to an increased sense of invincibility. As we examine Gao Chengyong's psychological profile, it's clear that his motivations were not those of an ordinary murderer. This was a man whose crimes were driven by a deep-seated need for control and dominance, a need to feel powerful in a world that had once made him feel small and insignificant. But as we attempt to understand Gao, we must also ask, can the darkness within a man be traced back to his upbringing, or is there something inherently twisted in his mind that drove him to these extremes? Is it simply the result of childhood trauma, or is it a deeper, more sinister force at play. For over 30 years, Gao Chengyong's killing spree haunted China. His identity remained a mystery, as the authorities were unable to link the gruesome murders together. The investigation, which started with little more than a series of cold crime scenes, would evolve into one of the longest manhunts in Chinese history. The first few murders in 1988 were isolated incidents. There was no apparent connection between them. But as the years went by, the investigators began to realize that something darker was at play. These were not random killings, they were part of a larger, more sinister pattern. Despite the growing body count, investigators struggled to find solid evidence. Gao was careful, leaving no fingerprints, no DNA, and no direct connections between the victims. Each murder seemed to vanish into thin air, adding another layer of frustration to the already complex case. As the years passed, the investigation continued, but the breakthroughs remained elusive. The case was cold. Yet, the authorities never stopped. They collected evidence, analyzed crime scenes, and consulted with experts. The killer was out there, but finding him seemed like a near impossible task. In 2002, after a decade of silence from the killer, Gao's attacks abruptly stopped. Authorities were left with more questions than answers. Had he moved away? Was he still alive? Or had he simply stopped his killings altogether? The case grew cold, and with each passing year, the possibility of solving it seemed more distant. But in 2016, a new tool emerged that would change everything: advanced DNA technology. With this breakthrough, the authorities were finally able to connect the dots and link the murders to a single man, Gao Chengyong. Using DNA evidence and the advancement of forensic technology, investigators were able to identify Gao Chengyong as the killer. They matched his genetic profile to evidence found at the crime scenes, and for the first time in over 3 decades, the authorities knew who they were looking for. Despite the technology finally pointing to Gao, the manhunt wasn't over. He had evaded capture for decades, and now it was time for the police to track him down. As the investigation picked up pace, the authorities began to close in on Gao Chengyong. In 2018, after years of searching, Gao Chengyong was finally apprehended. The killer, who had haunted China for over 3 decades, was brought to justice. But even in his capture, there remained many questions. How did a man like Gao remain undetected for so long? What made him believe he could evade the authorities for such an extended period? Gao Chengyong's arrest was the culmination of a decades-long investigation. It was a victory for the victims, for their families, and for the investigators who had tirelessly pursued the truth. But while the case was solved, the story of his victims, and the terror he inflicted on a nation, will never be forgotten. After 30 years of terror, the hunt for Gao Chengyong finally came to an end. In 2019, the court declared Gao guilty of 11 murders, sentencing him to death. The verdict was a long-awaited justice for the victims and their families, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter in understanding how someone like Gao could exist in the shadows for so long. As the world learned of Gao's conviction, the questions surrounding his motivations and the years of violence continued to linger. While justice had been served in the legal sense, what did this verdict truly mean for the families of the victims, and for those who lived in fear for so long? Gao Chengyong was not just a killer, he was a symbol of how unchecked darkness can fester in society. His conviction brought an end to a brutal chapter, but it raised a chilling truth: sometimes, The most dangerous predators are those who blend into society unnoticed, until it is too late. The psychological impact of Gao's crimes is profound. For the families of his victims, closure came too late. For the public, the realization that such a killer could exist in their midst for decades was a hard truth to swallow. Gao's life was a reminder that evil doesn't always wear an obvious face. At the heart of Gao's crimes was not just his thirst for control, but the fear he inspired. He wasn't just a killer, he was a ghost unseen, untraceable, until technology and persistence finally brought him to justice. But even then, his motives remained partially shrouded in mystery. Many wonder what truly motivated Gao Chengyong. Was it a deep-rooted need for power, a desire to reclaim control over a life that had always felt powerless? Or was it simply the dark nature of a mind twisted beyond repair? Some cases, like Gao's, leave more questions than answers. Despite his capture and conviction, the mystery of Gao's actions will never fully be understood. What is clear, however, is that he left behind a legacy of fear, loss, and unanswered questions. His story will forever serve as a reminder of the darkness that can exist within even the most ordinary people. At the end of the day, what was Gao Chengyong really seeking? Was it just bloodshed, or was he searching for something more: power, control, validation? A question that many may never fully answer, but one that will haunt all who delve into his twisted story. The hunt for Gao Chengyong may have ended, but the impact of his crimes will ripple through time. The lives of his victims can never be restored, and the trauma caused to their families remains a lifelong burden. In the end, justice was served, but the emotional scars will last forever. Ultimately, Gao Chengyong's story isn't just about the killer. It's about the lives he destroyed, the families left in mourning, and the system that failed to stop him for so long. It serves as a haunting reminder: some monsters walk among us, disguised in plain sight. And some stories remain, forever unresolved. Gao Chengyong's story is a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist within the most unsuspecting individuals. For over 3 decades, he haunted the streets of China, leaving behind a trail of terror and broken lives. But as with many cases of true crime, justice was eventually served, though the scars left by his crimes will never fade. His capture may have brought closure to the case, but it doesn't erase the pain or the fear that his victims' families still carry with them. The answers, though finally found, will never completely fill the void left behind by so many lost lives. While Gao Chengyong's name may now be linked to justice, his victims will always be more than just names on a cold case file. They were real people: mothers, daughters, sisters who deserve to be remembered. This case serves as a stark reminder that behind every headline, behind every statistic, there are lives that were irreparably changed. As we reflect on this story, we are left with more than just the image of a killer. We are reminded of the resilience of those who fight for justice, the strength of the victims' families, and the importance of never letting the past fade into the darkness. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the case of Gao Chengyong. We hope this story has left you with more questions, more reflections, and perhaps a better understanding of the darkness that can lurk just beneath the surface. If you found this case as disturbing as we did, and want to continue exploring more chilling true crime stories, make sure to subscribe to Crime in Review. Don't forget to like, share, and comment below with your thoughts. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. Thank you again for watching. We truly appreciate your time and your support. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and always question the world around you.